From its source in Yellowstone National Park, the Madison River winds through southwestern Montana until it meets up with the Gallatin and Jefferson Rivers to form the Missouri. Just outside the park, the Madison flows through a majestic landscape with tall peaks and trout-filled waters. It appears peaceful and inviting, and indeed, it has been the destination of millions of vacationers. But just before midnight on August 17, 1959, one of nature's most terrifying forces was unleashed in this narrow canyon. An earthquake, measuring 7.5 on the Richter scale, jolted the ground. At the time, it was the fourth strongest quake ever recorded in the United States. This computer animation shows the sequence of events that happened under the cover of darkness. First, at the epicenter of the quake, the Red Canyon and Hebgen Lake fault lines cracked and dropped 20 feet or more. 3 giant scarps ripped through the Madison River Canyon. Within seconds, the earthquake dealt its most damaging blow. Just at the point where the canyon drops into the plains, a massive block of canyon wall sheared off and slid with astonishing speed and force into the Madison River and halfway up the opposite canyon wall. The section of rock, 3/4 mile wide, hit the river like a platter dropping into a pan of water. The landslide displaced water in every direction. Instantly, the slide dammed the river, and water began to build up behind the slide, forming Earthquake Lake. At the same time this was happening, upstream another disaster was in the making. Hebgen Lake, created in 1915 when the Hebgen Dam was built, was sloshing over its banks like water in a pail. When the north side of the lake dropped some 20 feet, huge waves called seiches were formed. They overtopped the dam, washing into the river downstream. The first panicked reports from the canyon included the dreadful news that the Hebgen Dam had failed. If true, a massive wall of water would have blown out the slide downriver and wreaked havoc on the downstream communities. Fortunately, these reports were false. All of this destruction happened in seconds, and the scars still remain over 40 years later. Seemingly insignificant in the face of this force of nature were the lives of the 300 people camped in the canyon. The Hebgen Lake Earthquake struck on a calm, clear, moonlit night at the peak of the tourist season in Yellowstone. That night, at least 18,000 people were in the park. Around the region, campgrounds and local motels were filled to capacity. Even the roadsides were lined with cars and trailers. The quake rocked the land so violently that travelers awoke to sheer terror. Many woke to hear the roar of the rock slide, the crashing of the huge waves, and the rumbling of car-sized boulders tumbling off the canyon walls. Along Hebgen Lake, shoreline cabins, lodges, and travel trailers were inundated with water. Above the Madison River, boulders broke free and came crashing through the darkness, flattening tents and automobiles. In Yellowstone Park, the quake caused rock slides, streams moved out of their beds, and hot springs changed temperatures. Some 200 geysers simultaneously began spewing hot water and mud. Clepsydra Geyser went frantically wild and has erupted continuously since the quake. With so many people in the narrow Madison River Canyon, the quake was destined to take away life. Rock Creek Campground, filled to capacity with 50 campers, was partially buried. Survivors said the noise from the slide was deafening. The slab of mountain slid at 100 miles per hour, displacing the air in the narrow canyon. This created hurricane-force winds that tossed cars like matchboxes and ripped clothes off people who had no idea what hit them. As Earthquake Lake quickly began to fill, frightened campers had to flee for their lives. But the highway they had driven in on was now cracked into pieces. While the ground shuddered with aftershocks, about 250 survivors were forced to scramble uphill away from the rising water. Those who were able to flee were the lucky ones. 28 people never made it out alive. 19 bodies were never found and probably lie under the slide. 5 people drowned west of the slide area. 2 people died at the Bozeman Hospital from injuries, and 2 were crushed by a boulder at Cliff Lake Campground. How is it that this tranquil place was instantly thrown into chaos? What force could cause so much destruction in just a few seconds? How soon could it happen again? Although no one predicted the Hebgen Lake Earthquake, geologists had known for years that tremors frequented this region. The Madison Range in general, and the Hebgen Lake area in particular, have all the factors necessary for regular earthquakes. The region is laced with faults which are breaks in folded rocks. It is along these breaks that movement can occur. Layered rock that accumulated over millions of years has been uplifted and folded. Along the folds, thrust faults developed where the rock layers have broken. In between the faults are portions of earth called fault blocks. The faults involved in the Hebgen Lake Earthquake are the Hebgen Fault, the Red Canyon Fault, and the Madison Range Fault. The corresponding blocks are the 125-square-mile Hebgen Lake Block, the Red Canyon Block, and the Missouri Flats Block. When the earthquake occurred, all 3 blocks dropped within seconds of one another. Both the Red Canyon Block and the Hebgen Lake Block tipped toward their northern boundaries along the fault lines. While the dropping of the Red Canyon Block caused only minor damage, the Hebgen Lake Block caused significant damage. When this block dropped, it tilted Hebgen Lake 19 feet, creating the Seiche waves and causing the destruction of cabins and the road along the lake. The epicenter, or point directly above where the quake occurred, was located near Duck Creek and the junction of Highways 287 and 191, 8 miles north of West Yellowstone, Montana. The quake was powerful enough to be felt in 8 states, across 500,000 square miles. As with most natural disasters, the hours following the earthquake were marked by chaos. Hundreds of people had been trapped by the Madison River slide and the severed roads. Local, state, and federal authorities were unable to effectively organize until daylight, some 5 hours after the quake hit. Mrs. Grace Miller, a 70-year-old widow and owner of the Hillgard Fishing Lodge on Hebgen Lake, was awake when the quake began. She ran out of her lodge door and jumped across a 5-foot crevice just as her lodge dropped into the lake behind her. Some remnants of her cabins are still eerie reminders of that night. A man and his family trying to escape by highway drove off a 6-foot scarp along the Red Canyon Fault. Amazingly, no one was seriously injured. The Bennett family had traveled from Idaho and was camped along the Madison River, just downriver from the mouth of the canyon. Under the moonlight, Pearlie Bennett, his wife Irene, and their children Phil, Carol, Tom, and Susan spread out their tent and settled into sleeping bags. Pearlie and Irene were startled awake by a rumbling noise and shaking ground. They couldn't comprehend what was happening. Irene looked up to see her husband clutching a tree and bracing himself against the 100-mile-per-hour winds created by the rock slide. In the next instant, he disappeared into the night. A rush of water created when the slide hit the river washed the family away. Only Irene and her oldest son, Phil, survived. A California couple perished when a huge boulder crashed through the Cliff Lake campground, crushing them as they slept in their tent. Their 3 children, sleeping in a nearby tent, were unharmed. At dawn, the U.S. Air Force sent 4 helicopters to do search and rescue. The Forest Service dropped in smoke jumpers, who immediately began rescue operations as well. By the end of the day, 250 people had been rescued. When the new day's light filled the canyon, the scale of destruction became clear. The amount of water building up behind the rockslide was alarming. Whole sections of Highway 287 were destroyed. There were serious cracks in the Hebgen Dam. At final tally, $11 million of damage had been done to the roads, buildings, and campgrounds. The sinking of the north shore of Hebgen Lake left docks, beaches, and cabins underwater. But on the south shore, over 1,000 acres of muddy lake bed lay exposed. Between Hebgen Dam and the rockslide, the Halford Resort Camp consisted of about a dozen small cabins strung along the Madison River. When the river was plugged by the slide, the rising waters lifted the cabins from their foundations. They drifted aimlessly until the spillway was dug through the slide and the water level dropped. They are now referred to as Ghost Village, and they lie helter-skelter in the meadow next to the river. The most serious problem, however, was Earthquake Lake. With the survivors rescued, the Army Corps of Engineers began a race against time. Water rising behind the slide threatened to destroy the Hebgen Lake Dam, or worse, overtop the slide and flood downstream. Crews worked around the clock building a spillway for the water. On October 17th, the new spillway carried the water from Earthquake Lake downstream. The spillway kept the level of the lake at about 120 feet. Engineers predict that over time, as water erodes the spillway, Earthquake Lake will drain and the river will again run through the canyon. The bulk of the area hit by the quake is federal land, administered by the Forest Service. In 1960, a year after the quake, the Forest Service created the 38,000-acre Madison River Canyon Earthquake area. The visitor center marks the site of the Madison River slide. More than 75,000 visitors come here every year. The visitor center and the surrounding land provide travelers with a perspective on how the landscape and the people were suddenly changed on August 17, 1959. The memorial boulder, a remnant of the dolomite buttress that once anchored the canyon wall on the opposite side, is marked with a bronze plaque listing the names of the 28 victims. Their stories remained etched in time forever. The scars of the earthquake are now more than 40 years old. Some are still obvious, like the slide, the scarps, the skeletal trees, and Ghost Village. But some are beginning to soften as the land continues to heal. New trees are growing on the face of the slide, and vegetation is slowly blurring some of the scars. This landscape is an infant in geologic time, and surely one day the fault block will sink again. For now, this canyon is a reminder of how land and lives can change in an instant when a force of nature is unleashed.